Picture this. It's 1951. The hottest show on American television is about to go into production. The sets are built, the scripts are polished, and some are on stage 24 at Desilu Studios in Hollywood. Two actors are being introduced to each other for the very first time. They shake hands. They smile for the cameras. And, in that exact moment, something curdles between them. Something that no amount of professionalism, no paycheck, and no amount of audience applause would ever fully fix. The show was I Love Lucy. The actors were Vivian Vance and William Frawley. And what followed over the next 9 years was one of the most remarkable paradoxes in entertainment history. Two people who genuinely, deeply, and sometimes viciously despised each other, creating one of the most beloved marriages ever put on screen. This is the story of that war. How it started, how it escalated, how it accidentally produced comedy gold, and how, in the end, personal misery won out over a small fortune. To understand why Vivian Vance and William Frawley clashed so violently, you have to understand where each of them came from, because they didn't just come from different towns. They came from different eras entirely. William Frawley was born in 1887. Read that again, 1887. By the time television even existed as a medium, this man had already lived several full lifetimes. He came up through vaudeville, the brutal, rowdy, cutthroat world of live performance, where comedians played 3 shows a night in theaters that smelled like sawdust and cigarettes, where audiences didn't applaud politely. They threw things at you if you weren't funny enough. Vaudeville didn't breed sensitive artists. It bred survivors. It produced men and women who were thick-skinned, sharp-tongued, and allergic to anything that smelled like emotional vulnerability. By the time Frawley landed on the I Love Lucy set, he had appeared in over 100 films, usually playing grumpy, cynical everymen. For him, acting was a job. You showed up, you hit your marks, you said your lines, and then you went to the racetrack. He had no patience for long rehearsals, no tolerance for finding the character, and absolutely zero interest in making friends on set. Then there was Vivian Vance. Born in 1909, she was 22 years younger than Frawley, practically a different generation. Where Frawley had clawed his way up through vaudeville halls, Vance had trained for the Broadway stage. She was a genuine actress in the classical sense, emotionally intelligent, deeply invested in her craft, and someone who believed that performance required a certain level of psychological safety. She also suffered from severe clinical anxiety, what we would now recognize as panic disorder, which meant she genuinely needed a calm, supportive environment to do her best work. Beyond her craft, Vivian Vance was a natural beauty who had spent years fighting to be taken seriously as a leading lady. She was talented, she was stunning, and she was ambitious. So when Desi Arnaz came calling with an offer to play Ethel Mertz, the frumpy, dowdy, overweight neighbor to the most glamorous woman on television, she was already sacrificing something significant just by saying yes. To play Ethel, Vance was required to wear clothes that were deliberately 2 sizes too small, unflattering floral prints, and padding designed to ruin her silhouette. Every single day she went to work, she was being costumed as someone lesser than she believed herself to be. She was doing it for the paycheck, for the exposure, and because Lucille Ball herself had asked her personally. But it stung, and she hadn't even met Frawley yet. The explosion happened during the very first week of rehearsals for the pilot episode. Vivian Vance, already raw from the costume situation, already anxious about the direction her career was taking, took one look at William Frawley and made a mistake that would define the next decade of both their lives. She turned to Desi Arnaz and complained, not quietly, not discreetly, loudly, within full earshot of Frawley himself, that nobody would ever believe she was married to that old man. Now, you have to understand what that comment meant to a man like Frawley. He was a vaudeville veteran who had spent 50 years in show business. He had lived through the Depression, the war years, the collapse of the studio system. His ego was enormous and his skin, though thick, was not bulletproof. In that one thoughtless moment, Vivian Vance had done 2 unforgivable things simultaneously. She had insulted his age and his appearance, and she had done it publicly, in front of the man writing both their paychecks. Frawley decided, right then and there, that Vivian Vance was a prima donna who needed to be taken down several pegs. He didn't see a colleague anymore. He saw a target, And William Frawley, veteran of 1,000 hostile audiences, knew exactly how to hit a target where it hurt. He started with the remarks. Cutting, calculated, always delivered with a smirk, the kind of jokes that had just enough plausible deniability to avoid a direct confrontation. He called her the girl who couldn't act. He made snide references to her Broadway airs. He knew she was sensitive about her weight and her appearance. She was already self-conscious about the Ethel costumes, so those became his favorite targets. He would comment on how she looked in those unflattering dresses. He would suggest to the writers, loudly enough for her to hear, that they give Ethel more scenes involving food. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. And it worked. The personal animosity was bad enough. But what made it truly unbearable was the way it collided with their completely incompatible approaches to the work itself. Vivian Vance was a perfectionist. She prepared extensively. She needed multiple takes to find the precise comedic beat she was looking for, and her anxiety meant that any disruption to her process could derail an entire scene. She thrived on collaboration and collapsed under cruelty. William Frawley barely memorized his lines. He showed up relying entirely on his natural grumpiness and 60 years of instinct to carry him through. He found long rehearsals pointless and exhausting. He was, by every account, a one-take wonder, not because he was supremely talented in a precise way, but because he had no patience for the alternative. So when Vance would ask for another take to nail a specific moment, Frawley would roll his eyes, stare at the ceiling, or deliberately make her laugh at the wrong moment just to guarantee they'd need yet another take. He mumbled his lines during rehearsals. He looked at his watch while she was in the middle of an emotionally complex setup. He stared off into space during her most vulnerable moments, a message that said, louder than any insult, "You don't matter enough for my attention." Vance, for her part, was not entirely passive. She was a brilliant comedic technician who knew exactly how to use the physical grammar of a multi-camera sitcom to her advantage. She learned to position herself to take the light away from Frawley during his punchlines. She perfected the art of adding a tiny piece of physical business, adjusting a prop, brushing her hair, precisely when he was meant to land a joke. These were professional acts of sabotage, invisible to the audience, but felt deeply by everyone on the crew. The set became a divided territory. Stage 24 at Desilu Studios was effectively the Berlin Wall in miniature, with Fred Mertz on one side and Ethel Mertz on the other, communicating only through the medium of fictional insults and barely concealed contempt. Here is where the story gets truly strange. Because while all of this very real, very ugly animosity was festering off camera, something extraordinary was happening on screen. The writers started to notice it first. When Ethel shot Fred one of those narrow-eyed glares, Vivian Vance wasn't really acting annoyed. She was genuinely wondering what she had done to deserve this man in her professional life. That authentic edge, that real flicker of contempt, was unlike anything you could manufacture in a casting session or a rehearsal. It was raw, it was specific, and it was electric. While Lucy and Ricky Ricardo were the high-energy, glamorous, musical heart of the show, Fred and Ethel Mertz became the reality check. They were the couple who had been married so long they communicated entirely in sighs and eye rolls. They were the couple who insulted each other out of habit and loved each other out of something even more stubborn than habit. Audiences found them deeply, viscerally relatable, because the truth underneath the comedy wasn't manufactured warmth. It was the genuine wear of two people who could not entirely escape each other. Frawley understood this intuitively, even if he'd never have articulated it that way. He knew that when he delivered a line with a little extra venom, a crack about Ethel's appetite or her spending, he wasn't just playing Fred Mertz. He was taking a real shot at the woman standing 3 feet away. And because Vance was so emotionally attuned, so sensitive, her reactions were pure gold. Her jaw would set, her eyes would flash. And that was the kind of comedic truth you cannot teach in a classroom. The writers began mining this dynamic deliberately. The sharper the insults in the script, the better the ratings climbed. It was a feedback loop from hell. Their genuine mutual misery was making them two of the most beloved characters in the history of American television. For Vance, this was a nightmare with excellent press. She was winning awards in fan mail and critical praise for playing a woman she was embarrassed to be. She was being celebrated for a chemistry that was built on her own humiliation. And every time a fan stopped her on the street and shouted, "Hey, Ethel, where's that old man of yours?" it was a reminder of the very comment that had started the war. By the late 1950s, I Love Lucy had become something beyond a television show. It was a cultural institution. Fred and Ethel Mertz were as recognizable as any couple in America, fictional or otherwise. Desi Arnaz, the brilliant businessman behind the Desilu empire, recognized what he had. He looked at the ratings, he looked at the chemistry, and he looked at the future. And he made an offer. The Mertzes, a spin-off series built entirely around William Frawley and Vivian Vance, was proposed with salaries that, in the late 1950s, represented life-changing money. $50,000 per season was the figure being discussed. That was not simply a good paycheck. That was a fortune. That was the kind of security that people who had lived through the Depression did not turn down. William Frawley was in his 70s by this point. His health was beginning to show the wear of a lifetime spent in smoky bars and drafty backstage corridors. He knew, with the clear eyes of a man who had been in show business long enough to see fortunes evaporate, that he was in the final chapter of his career. The spin-off was his retirement plan, his legacy, his chance to cement the Fred Mertz character as his own, independent of Lucy and Desi. He didn't care that he despised Vivian. He was a man of the Depression. You did not turn down a paycheck. You showed up. You did the job. You cashed the check. He waited for the call. He assumed, with the certainty of a man who has never seriously questioned his own logic, that Vivian Vance would come to the same obvious conclusion. He was catastrophically wrong. For Vivian Vance, the end of I Love Lucy was not the end of a successful career phase. It was a parole date. She had spent 9 years being Ethel. 9 years in those humiliating costumes. 9 years of Frawley's remarks about her weight, her anxiety, her Broadway airs. 9 years of going home after long filming days and sitting with the knowledge that the man she had to pretend to love on screen had spent the afternoon trying to make her feel small. When Desi presented her with the spin-off offer, she didn't hesitate. She turned it down completely. She reportedly told him that she would not work with that man again if he paved the streets with gold. No amount of money, she made clear, was worth another season of what she had already survived. When the news reached Frawley that the spin-off was dead, that his retirement plan had been dismantled by Vivian Vance's refusal, his dislike hardened into something colder and more permanent. He didn't just resent her anymore. He felt she had reached into his pocket and stolen his future. He told anyone who would listen that she was an ungrateful Broadway amateur who had been handed the opportunity of a lifetime by a show she would never have booked without him, and had repaid that gift by ruining everything. He never forgave her. Not once. Not even close. After I Love Lucy ended, both actors moved on in completely opposite emotional directions. Vivian Vance moved to Connecticut, married her fourth husband John Dodds, and found the kind of personal stability that the Lucy years had made impossible. She eventually came back to work with Lucille Ball on The Lucy Show, but only after securing something she had never had before, a contract that guaranteed her character would not be frumpy. No bad costumes. No ridiculous padding. No fictional husband to be belittled by. She would play Vivian Bagley, a stylish, independent woman, and she would be treated accordingly. It was, among other things, a very deliberate and very public message to everyone who had watched her suffer through 9 years of Ethel Mertz. William Frawley landed on his feet too, joining the cast of My Three Sons as the grumpy grandfather figure Bub O'Casey. The young cast adored him. He was beloved in the role. But by every account, he never fully shook the ghost of the Mertz years. He was often found at his regular table at Musso and Frank Grill on Hollywood Boulevard, nursing a drink and muttering darkly about the Broadway girl, who had cost him his spin-off. The bitterness was a permanent resident. The two of them lived in the same city, moved in the same professional circles, and shared a legendary status that neither could escape. But they never reconciled. There was no lunch where they buried the hatchet, no tearful phone call, no gracious joint interview where they admitted it had all been a misunderstanding. They existed in a state of mutual, permanent, icy avoidance. When Frawley's health began to seriously decline in the mid-1960s, heart disease had been steadily claiming him. He did not reach out to his television wife, and she did not send flowers. The end came on March 3, 1966. William Frawley was walking down Hollywood Boulevard after seeing a movie when he suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed on the sidewalk. He died just a few blocks from his star on the Walk of Fame. It was, in a strangely fitting way, a Hollywood death, sudden, public, on the streets he had walked for 50 years. When reporters reached Vivian Vance for a comment, she was reportedly at dinner with her husband. According to witnesses, when the news arrived at her table, she did not cry. She did not offer a solemn tribute to his talent or his decades of service to the industry. Instead, she allegedly called for champagne for everyone at the restaurant. That story, whether it happened exactly that way or has been slightly polished by decades of retelling, reveals something essential and true about the depth of what had passed between them. To the world, William Frawley was a beloved television icon. To Vivian Vance, he was the man who had bullied her, mocked her insecurities, made her feel worthless, and stolen a decade of her dignity in exchange for a paycheck and a character she was ashamed to play. His death wasn't a tragedy to her. It was a door closing on the worst chapter of her life. Vivian Vance lived until 1979. In her final years, she battled breast cancer and the effects of a stroke, but she remained sharp and reflective about what the I Love Lucy years had meant. She spoke about the show with a mixture of genuine pride and quiet pain. She knew she had been part of something immortal. She knew Ethel Mertz would outlive her by centuries, and she had come to a kind of peace with that, as long as she never had to be Ethel again. She once said that people would always love Ethel, but they never really knew Vivian, and she seemed, in the end, to be okay with that distinction. The great, tragic irony of the entire Vance-Frawley feud is this. Everything that made Fred and Ethel Mertz feel real, the grit of genuine contempt, the spark of actual anger, the weight of two people who have run out of patience with each other and yet cannot quite let go, was real. The writers didn't invent that texture. The directors didn't choreograph that authentic exhaustion. It was imported, every single episode, from the actual emotional lives of two people who absolutely could not stand each other. They were professionals in the deepest sense. They hated each other with passion, but they loved the comedy just a little bit more. Every time those cameras rolled, they left their war in the wings and became Fred and Ethel, the most relatable married couple in the history of American television. The audience laughed. The ratings soared. And behind the scenes, two people who despised each other were quietly, privately paying the price. That is the story of Vivian Vance and William Frawley. Not the wholesome version. Not that they were secretly fond of each other. Revision that nostalgia tends to apply to old Hollywood legends. The real version. The one where two talented, complicated, deeply flawed human beings created something extraordinary out of mutual loathing. And where one of them, at least, refused to let the money talk her back into the cage. Vivian Vance said no to $50,000 and a guaranteed hit show because her peace of mind was worth more. In Hollywood, in any industry built on the relentless pursuit of more, that decision still stands as one of the most quietly radical things anyone ever did.